Hey, Stephen, thank you for coming in today. Just a remarkable background. Definitely one of purposeful leadership, purposeful capital, innovation, impact across so many different dimensions. Just an illustrious career contribution and continuing in just remarkable ways. And the way you're transforming healthcare, not only in the U.S., but the model, transforms the world. So just a simply impactful life and a great role model, or what some of my YPO friends would say, like a North Star. For the planet. So,
Thank you.
so thank you for coming in and sharing your insights.
Thank you for having me.
So, Stephen, my audience, I actually measure it. In order. It's co or founders, CEOs, co-founders, presidents, and board directors, and then it's academics and professors and so on, right? So that's kind of the order. So it really skews to executives. So just to give you a sort of a background, but there's students in there, and as I mentioned, professors and scientists. One of the questions that people always ask me, and so they always want me to ask the interviewee, in this case you, is you've got this remarkable background, just outstanding contribution and accomplishment and recognitions, and you're continuing to shape the world. But what were those pivotal moments in your life that made this wonderful person you are today? And it could be two or three, and it could be when you were three or five or 10 inside, outside school. It could be mentors inside, outside the family. There's got to be these pivotal moments that have shaped you to who you are today.
Well, thank you again, Stephen, for having me on. And for me, a big part of my journey is I've had some amazing mentors, or I'll say I call them guardian angels. And one of them was my grandmother. My grandmother raised her family in a small enclave in Iraq called Tel Kappa. And was a very mixed community, Christians, Muslims, and different tribes. She had 12 children. When number 12 was in utero, her husband passed away. So she was raising 12 children on her own. I have three children, Stephen, and I'm sucking wind much of the time. The fact that she was able to do that, and she was a midwife. That's how she supported her family. So she would go and do deliveries all hours of the day and night to support her family. Oftentimes, she would come back home and the family didn't have any means to actually pay her money. So she bartered. She would sometimes get food, sometimes get services. But she was very clever, and she brought all 12 children to the United States. It was actually very challenging circumstances how she did that. And I just remember when I was around her, Stephen, she had so much joy in giving. Now, this was a person that never had a lot of means. She literally, anything she had, she would give to her children. And she had to divvy up with a lot of wisdom because she had many children. But she had so much joy. And that always imbued upon myself that giving, servant leadership, there was a treasure that money couldn't buy. She had a joy, Stephen, that would illuminate the darkest room. I mean, and it wasn't money, it wasn't power, it wasn't fame, it was the joy in giving. And she literally, that's something that I always remembered. And then my father was a physician in Iraq, and he left under challenging circumstances. When he got to the US, he had to do all of his training over again. Um, it was a kind of a political retribution because he left um, on his own terms, and he came here in 1966. He met my mother in 67. They got married and they had me in 1970. And I just remember growing up, my dad never complained. He was working multiple jobs to go to school. Um, and the richness was the richness in the family. There was such joy in having a family meal. It was like, and even though we didn't have much means at all, the richness of our family, the richness of the spirit, Stephen, those are treasures that I carry with me today from my grandmother and my father. And I truly believe that people that are givers are happier. In my time with you, I've seen you have that same spirit. You're always sharing of your time and your talent, which is your ultimate treasures. And that's something that I've never forgotten. And that spiritual bank account is something that's very near and dear to my heart, and it's something that I always remember. And then, along the way, I've had a lot of great people that have helped me, other guardian angels, and I believe that, what I've learned on my journey is that, there's a lot of legends in the cemetery, but there's very few legacies. And those people that imprint their time, their energy, their love, their intellect on others, that's the legacy, that's the treasures that really matter. In this world, a lot of people think about, there's a certain group of folks that think about scarcity. They have a scarcity mindset. If I give, there's less for me. And that's probably, Stephen, the majority of the world. But I think people like yourself and my grandmother and my father really came from a minority perspective called abundance. The more you give, the more you get back. And I really believe that that's very important. And I think our world, the more people that we have in that camp, the more people that believe the investments we make in people, not just financial, but intellectual capital, relationship capital, the more that we give, the more you get back. I think our world would be a better place. That's why I enjoy so much spending time with you, because I believe that you're in that abundance camp.
So I'm just reflecting on what you're saying. I mean, your grandmother and your father were really transformational to you, and by example, and really this idea of servant leadership and giving and abundance, and not thinking of it in terms of when you're giving, then you're sort of reducing the number of resources. You're really, what you're saying is, by giving and sharing, you make the world better, and you actually are a catalyst for more to happen in a positive way. And I can see that then definitely in your purposeful leadership in business and capital and innovation. I mean, it's purposefulness throughout the entire sort of spectrum and across so many communities. You have this educational background too, excuse me, and you graduated from Birmingham Brother Rice High School, summa cum laude, was awarded a merit scholarship to attend Wayne State University. And then you won many leadership awards at Wayne State, Outstanding Student Leader, a Howard Hughes Medical Research Grant awardee, and so on. And you were elected to the Wayne State University Board of Governors, and you went to Wayne State University Medical School. Can you talk about that experience? So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about your educational experience, and then we'll get into the companies and then what you plan to do into the future. But can you talk about that journey, your educational journey?
Yes. So I graduated Birmingham Brother Rice in 1988. I was a little geeky, I'm not going to lie. I never missed a class. I never got detention. I was never late. I wish I would have kept all of those, kept it going after that. But I remember our principal telling me, you're you know you know you know, telling me, hey, I wish I had a recognition for those things. But my father, the thing I always remembered about that, my father used to drive me to school every day, and he used to give me the same lecture every day. Son, don't drink, don't smoke, don't take drug, son. And he would give me the same lecture every day. So it was those moments with my father in the car were absolutely priceless. But I think I think in high school it was a very formative time for me because I had some amazing teachers. So there was a gentleman named Brother King. Brother King taught me Latin, and I was in his last class before he passed away. He taught for I think 50 years, but I was literally in his last class, and it was one of those classes that he had complete attention, complete focus of all the students. Nobody talked, no one fidgeted. It was you knew that you had to give 100%, and so But I think during high school, what was important for me was I started to improve my intellectual foundation, and I think the most important thing about education is you realize how little you really know. The more you learn, you realize how little you know, and certainly when I hang around you, Stephen, I'm learning so much all the time. But I think also you learn to question and you learn to ask, and I think in high school the thing that I was questioning most was, of course, you want to know what career would be good for me. Um, but I think I started to ask along the way, what was my meaning? What was my purpose? And why did God put me on this earth? And, I started to ask those questions, and those are not easy questions to answer. And, and so as I went through, high school, I got this merit scholarship to go to Wayne State, which at that point it was a pretty sweet gig. They paid for everything, so I could I had opportunities to go elsewhere and take loans out, and it would have been fun to maybe go somewhere else, but to be in a position where my education was completely paid, that was fun. As part of the scholarship, I could take as many classes as I could fit in. So many of the semesters I took 20 plus credits, but there were some fun credits. Like I took racquetball. I learned how to play racquetball. I learned how to play tennis. I kind of, being Middle Eastern, you always take advantage of those things. So I took a lot of classes and a lot of recreational things. I always took one, and it was a good way for me to kind of broaden my horizons. But that was kind of a pivotal. Going from high school to college and staying local was pivotal for me, because most people would head elsewhere, and I certainly had those opportunities. But as fate would have it, by being closer to home, I was also able to kind of keep tabs on our family business enterprises, and um, and family was very, very, and as always has been very, very important for us. And so it afforded me that opportunity. I think ultimately I always knew that I wanted to go into healthcare, based on you know my grandmother, seeing how happy she was and doing what she was, delivering babies. And by the way, it's pretty surreal when someone comes up to me and says, "Your grandmother delivered me." It's kind of surreal, Like now, it doesn't get me a cup of coffee with anyone, but it's still pretty cool. But and then my father, he started a medical lab during this time, and I was going to medical school. So, every time I came home, and of course, being the obedient son, I would come home and see my parents. And oh, by the way, I would bring my laundry. I would take a bunch of food back home. So there were some perks to being relatively close to home, but it gave me an opportunity to kind of keep tabs on what my father was doing, which he had a medical lab for 10 years. And then as I was graduating medical school, he ended up getting an offer to someone to buy his company. So someone offered him about $10 million to buy his company. And, at that time, it's a lot of money today, but back then it was even much greater. Um, and he took the offer. And that also was a pivotal moment because he was officially retired for about 5 weeks. My mother eventually kicked him out of the house, imploring him that he needed to go do something. And because of a non-compete, he couldn't get back into the lab business. But he saw an opportunity. He in Medicare started to really clamp down on the medical labs right around that time. So the labs used to give very, liberally a bunch of free supplies, gloves, gauze, needles, or whatever. And Medicare started to come in and put some guide rails, regulatory guide rails on what could be given. And so the need for supplies started to increase. So my dad started this little 400 square foot facility called J&B Medical. And I just remember that he would go to work every single day. He would leave about 7:30, come back at 7 or 8. And when I would get home from medical school, of course, bringing my laundry, bringing my food, or, bringing my Tupperware to stock up on some home cooked meals. I remember my father used to get a lot of questions from many of our relatives. Why are you working so hard? What is this all about? And one of them, I won't mention her name, one of my aunts said, forget this medical stuff. Why don't you go open up a gas station? And I remember my dad, that was like a kick in the proverbial, abdomen there. And he was kind of hurt because, people didn't really see the vision, see what he was trying to do. Now, of course, that person today was always believed from minute one, right? So, um, but I remember my dad, um, there's a thing, and it's so true. So many people say seeing is believing. I hear that. When you see, you believe. The reality is, when you believe, that's when you see. That's when you see. And it's not the other way around. And my father, even though he didn't have any reason to believe, he just believed. And he had this incredible determination, incredible faith, and this mindset that anything was possible. And I think, to share with some of the entrepreneurs on the phone, on this, that'll hear this, I think that was absolutely critical because, many times, Martin Luther King said, faith is taking the first step, even when you don't see the whole staircase. And my father had this, this incredible, resolute faith that something great was going to happen. I don't think he ever realized what J&B could become or would become, but he just believed. And it's something that I'm trying to share with my children, and I try to share with as many folks as that I come across on my journey as well.
It's interesting. Again, I'm reflecting on your journey from high school to university, and you indicated that you got this opportunity to ask questions, and you're very curious, and that sparks this sort of journey of, there's these 4 stages, right? You're unconsciously incompetent initially, right? You don't even know you're incompetent. Then you become consciously incompetent. Then you go, I didn't know that. And you become conscious you didn't know that. And then you become consciously competent. And then you become unconsciously competent. So this kind of journey of of awareness, but it has to start at the beginning. And you've been doing this in your whole journey of even when you're unconsciously incompetent, realizing that I've got to turn that into at least conscious incompetence and start asking the questions. And then you get into the realization you can build skills, gain knowledge, and so on. And then I love the idea that your dad has this dream and there's naysayers, but you got to live that dream because believing makes the reality. And people, and you're right, a lot of people have to see the reality first before they believe, but you got to believe and then you can create the vision, right? And there's so many instances of that, and you're doing that as well. So I can see this journey. I can see the different stages, and you constantly being curious, and I know that of you. And you trained in family practice at the North Oakland Medical Center, and you did a fellowship at Wayne State University in occupational environmental health. So you got this sort of broad spectrum of interests. And then you talk about J&B and your executive servant leader. I love the way you describe it. And it's a global healthcare solutions company. I mean, you have 18 businesses, you're global, you're in all 40 or in 48 states of the US. So can you talk about more about that company and where you are today and what you hope to become? But let's start about those 18 businesses and give a description because you indicated you started with something that was 400 square feet. Well, you're bigger than 400 square feet today. So
Yeah, so I think there was so many key things to us getting where we are today. I think one of the things on our journey, Stephen, was to identify what our meaning, what our purpose is. And I think when you chase your passion, you find your purpose. And so we come from a healthcare background, and our meaning, our purpose was to make healthcare as affordable and accessible to as many people globally as we could. That was our meaning. That was our purpose. Okay. And once we realized what that was, then it didn't matter what was happening in the world. It didn't matter what was happening in the marketplace. When you do something and it's part of your meaning, your purpose, I think that is when you can, build extraordinary things. And we're very ordinary people. But I think because we tapped into our purpose and our meaning, that was pivotal for us. So we have many different business lines. Medical distribution, where we sell everything that goes in a hospital, pharmacy, physician's office, supply equipment, pharmaceuticals. That's where we started in 1996. We evolved started to provide I'll call niche marketplaces like emergency medical supplies, animal health. Animal health is a very large business for us today, and we're combining animal health and human health. People spend more on their animals than they do themselves in many cases. And people that have animals, there's a lot of data that shows improved outcomes, medical outcomes, improved quality of life, and lower costs. So there's a lot of data. You can go to hobry.org, which has a lot of, I think, very compelling data on the benefits of people having animals. But our claim to fame is we're one of the largest third-party billers of consumable medical products to the homes in the United States. Diabetic supplies, wound care, ostomy, insulin pumps, continuous glucose monitors. We reach 260 million covered lives via insurance contracts today. We have a mail order pharmacy licensed in 49 states, and we reach 170 million covered lives today. We have a telemedicine telehealth company that just got rebranded. It's called J&B Virtual Solutions. And we are doing a variety of different telehealth visits globally, with a big focus on mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse, and social determinants of health. That's a big area of focus for us. And by the way, telemedicine was my dad's baby. He died 3 years ago. but he he couldn't turn his computer on and off. But telemedicine was the second coming. So he's so that's one of the many legacies of my father. But you know, we're in 48 states, we're in 28 countries, a family business. Part of the beauty of a family business is I get fires quite regularly, but fortunately, I have three grandchildren from my mother. So a little job security on many, but not all occasions. But you know, look, I think when people ask me who is J&B, I was in Kentucky a few years ago, and um, you know, I'm with J&B, and everyone got so excited they thought we were the Scotch whiskey, and I'm like, I'm so sorry, forgive me, but you know, we're not that. But the best way I like to describe J&B is a platform of purpose and possibilities, and again, making healthcare affordable and accessible to as many people globally is what we do. It's who we are, and I think everything when you know what's in your DNA, I think you can, you know, you can build so much from it. And that was, you know, and we're continuing to innovate. Jack Welch always said that the rate of innovation internally has to be greater than the rate of what's going on externally. And so, you know, we're constantly trying to do it, but we're really been on this journey from a products company to a population health company. So, and measuring, managing, and optimizing large populations of patients is you know, where you know we're rapidly headed, and it's really an honor. It's really an honor to be on this journey. We're just stewards of the blessings.
So my audience, a big portion of my audience are very technical, right? So that, they have a strong technical sort of orientation. When you're doing virtual healthcare and remote care, there's technology involved, digitization. And I would say COVID has actually accelerated that virtual healthcare element. I mean, I see it in Canada, where it was virtually non-existent, and now it's accepted. So what are your plans on the digitization of healthcare? And the US is a complex environment, right? You got different regimes, different sort of modalities, how things are handled. You have some standards, but other things are, maybe some resistance. How are you going to address that gap? And then how are you going to address the sort of the journey between what you're doing now and then to be the biggest sort of population health provider in the US and then scale that globally? But starting locally, scale it through the US and globally.
Well, there's a lot of different aspects to that. So first, let me frame this a little bit. US healthcare today is about a $4.5 trillion enterprise. It is currently the fourth largest um, uh, economy in the world. And it will be in 2025 the third largest economy in the world. By 2030, it's going to be $6.8 trillion. So just so you can frame how big just US healthcare is. Now, for us, one of the key, determinants of who is going to be successful moving forward is going to be how people leverage data and information. So right now in US healthcare, Stephen, if you come to the US and you go see a doctor, a claim is generated, a billing claim, and the claim is adjudicated. And once it's adjudicated or paid, someone aggregates or different parties aggregate it, they de-identify it, and they sell the information back. By and large, we're making clinical and financial decisions in US healthcare based on retrospective information. One of the advantages that we have at J&B is because we are a provider of a variety of different products and services, we have what we call pre-adjudication data and information. And there's a variety of different ways that we're able to leverage that. So you can do continuous quality improvement. So everyone talks about data, data. Well, in healthcare, there's mountains and mountains of data. I think the latest statistic I saw is every 72 days, the amount of medical data doubles. I mean, think about that. It's mind-numbing. So, but the real question should be, how do I take the actionable data and do something with it? How do you take the actionable data and put it in data visualization tools where the key stakeholders can real-time measure, manage, and optimize every aspect of patient care? And I think there's a lot of different folks out there doing a variety of different things. Of course, as you know, there's all the tech folks that and they're using AI and they're using and so there's a lot of folks out there. There's folks like ourselves that sit on mountains and mountains of data, and I think whoever can come up with these strategic partnerships, these strategic alliances, not just with the key stakeholders, but I also believe that they've got to be public-private partnerships, because in the US, it's a little different system than in Canada, and there's some folks that believe healthcare is should be run by the government. Some people believe it's the private sector should be leading the charge. We believe that it's public-private partnerships that are going to ultimately lead to sustainable and lasting improvement in healthcare. So a big focus is for us is data, but not only the data, but the interoperability. Because you can have all this data, but how do you share the data in a timely fashion where you can impact patient care, you can impact continuous quality improvement initiatives? That, to me, is where the rubber is going to meet the road. And I think that's an area we're putting tremendous focus, investing a lot of time and energy and resources to. Now, let me also say this. The world is, becoming a smaller place every day. Now with global internet, global connectivity, people in different countries are able to use their phones to, provide some access to healthcare. I think the most important thing some lessons learned from the pandemic is that if we're good in the US, but, other places are struggling, ultimately that could have an impact on us. And I think that's a lesson learned. So we cannot think of healthcare, and yes, we're based in the US, that's where a majority of our businesses, but I think it's very important to have a much broader perspective. And, we're all divine beings on a human journey, and, access to affordable and accessible healthcare to people globally should be a fundamental right to all. Now, we can argue the best way to do that, but that's how we see the world, and that's where I see there's tremendous opportunities. The people that can leverage the data and information most effectively are the people that are going to move the needle in healthcare in the US and globally.
One of the things, I mean, I spoke at South by Southwest, and there was myself and a doctor. And the whole session was like an hour or 2 hours, was just the two of us on stage with a moderator talking about healthcare and digitization and innovation that's happening in healthcare. And there's been a lot of solutions in healthcare, specifically for doctors, like in radiology, but there's been sort of resistance. What is your view of that sort of bridge or gap in the adoption at the practice level, using tools that are like AI and so on? And do you see ways to bring clinicians along to be more sort of friendly to some of the technology that's out there? And I guess that will influence some of your population health initiatives as well, right? So,
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things. So first of all, the incentives today in healthcare don't always align with some of these health and wellness initiatives. Um, and so, you know, they're evolving, but it's never quite the rate of where things are at. So frankly, in the US, if a physician doesn't have an incentive to do something, it's tough to get them to do it, just to be brutally honest. Now, things are changing in the payer world, and I think that's going to permeate down to the provider. So let me give you an example. In a place like Michigan, a large health plan may have large Medicaid health plan may have 5% of their monies held back. And they call them the holdbacks, and based on them achieving certain quality goals over a period of time. And so that those buckets of monies that are held back now are evolving, and they're including more around social determinants of health. So a big thing people don't realize, 85% of quote unquote health is not medical care. Okay. It's your food, it could be your financial situation. It could be, your ability for transportation. They call them the social determinants of health, healthy opportunities. And there is very compelling data that shows that if you live in certain zip codes, your life expectancy is a lot less. And you can correlate it to access to, for example, healthy, nutritious food. So I think what's going to happen more and more is that these buckets of monies tied into certain quality initiatives are evolving, and as they evolve, the physicians are going to have quote unquote more incentive to do certain things. But let me put my physician hat on for a little bit. And I've delivered 100 babies in my career. If as a physician, with electronic medical records and the requirements the physicians have today, to deliver care are higher than they've ever been. So, the time that they actually spend with the patients is diminishing, and but their administrative and regulatory requirements are increasing. So, there's certain innate challenges, but I think at the end of the day, when the proverbial, forgive me, I use the word hummus all the time, which is a metaphor for good food and good times and financial fortune. But when the proverbial hummus is on the line, I think that um, more and more, some of these investments in health and wellness are going to be adopted. But it's the rate of healthcare, the cost of healthcare is just it's unbelievable. If you look at other sectors, like if you look at the cost of a television, for example, over the last 15 years, or you can look at a lot of goods and services, they've gone down because they've gotten commoditized. Well, guess what? Healthcare keeps going up. So in the US, so we definitely need to rethink and reimagine how the incentives for delivering care are done. And then the other part of this that you have to look at is medical education. So medical education, when I went to medical school, it was $9,600 a year, and I had 5 years deferment. I left with $70,000 in debt, and I didn't have to pay my loans back for 5 years. Now, in-state, Wayne State is $36,000 a year, and that's just your tuition, and then if you add in all the other stuff, you're probably $70,000 a year. And then the clock starts ticking right now. It's like another mortgage. So, the challenges are the cost of getting a medical education are increasing. and the financial remuneration are going down. And so, there's some inherent issues when you look at this whole thing. And but I think to really, really move the needle, it's really through the payers, and whether it's the federal government, whether it's insurance companies, and we definitely have to make more investments in health and wellness. And I think it's headed in the right direction, but it's never fast enough.
I mean, you have the advantage because you work with all stakeholders, right? So you're going direct to consumer, you're going direct to the different providers out there on an institutional kind of level. You're also working with the payers. I mean, your ecosystem is the entire landscape, and so you're really perfectly situated on your population health. So where do you see yourself, let's say, in 3 years on the population health initiative?
So one of my dear friends said that open AI is to AI what J&B is to population health. And I think and then of course my dear friend is Stephen who said that. But I think J&B has that opportunity. I think we can be a catalyst, a transformational change agent in healthcare. Um, but to do that, we have to make significant investments around data and interoperability, around technology, um, and also we have to invest in workforce development. So one of the things that people don't often think about, we have a very diverse population in the United States and globally. But there's a lot of medical data and statistics that show that underserved population, minority populations do better when they're taken care of by their own. So we can have all the technology in the world, but I think, training, providing as part of that health literacy to not just the patients, but also key stakeholders within these various communities. I think that's something that's going to be very important. So I think we have to build these ecosystems. Someone said, I think it was Hillary Clinton, it takes a village. And I think it really is, whoever can kind of be the air traffic controller of all these key stakeholders, and leveraging technology, leveraging innovation. You know what innovation is in healthcare, Stephen? It's integration. The people that can bring these things together, those are the folks that really are, can move the needle, change the paradigm. And, it's an honor and a privilege to be where we're at. I think we have a lot of advantages being private. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of challenges in the public markets, and so being private and having no outside monies in our company, I think affords us some opportunities that we may not have in a different construct. And but I think now, my philosophy to everyone on my team is think big and think bigger. You can't just change incrementally. You just can't. You have to really go big. And because with AI now and with everything going on in the world, you're not going to move the needle incrementally.
I guess this gets to this whole biomedical innovation that's occurring, precision in personalized medicine. I mean, you can go to the gene level, to molecular level. There's all sorts of wearables and devices and monitoring that's occurring. In fact, there's a lot of a distribution of awareness and monitoring that is now at the consumer level, and because of all the tech that's coming out there. You see this revolution also occurring in AI machine learning, where people have just ready access. And in fact, I think a lot of people now, when they want to just sort of do a little bit of analysis of what their situation is, they'll just type it into some chat technology, at least to get a bit of awareness. And then they'll take that knowledge to their physician or healthcare provider, but they're much more informed. And the data that they're generating about themselves is much greater. So there's great confluence of all of this. And so where do you see that going? all of the amazing confluence of technologies that are bearing down on the consumer and providing them access. And I guess the accessibility is maybe the question, right? Is it going to be fairly distributed to all areas and all people, or is it going to be a sort of a select few who are going to have this kind of access? And then what are your thoughts about all of that?
So you first have to start. We have an issue in the US called HIPAA, where patient information, patient privacy. So depending on whose numbers you believe, um, some folks say because of HIPAA, it cost a system, 30, $40 billion, without sharing medical data, medical information. Now, part of that is also the way that the electronic medical records, got set up, and they weren't required to share data, share information. Um, but but anyway, for me personally, I think that as we work with different key constituencies out there, including the consumers, if you ask the question, are you willing to share part or all of your medical data in return for lower healthcare premiums, lower healthcare costs? A vast majority, over 80% of the folks say yes. So, but I think where you have to start first, and this is where I'll say this lovingly, we have more scars than stars. Okay. So someone can come in and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to do this. But, at the end of the day, in the US, the patients have to agree to share their data. And, there's a lot of back and forth. But I think what you do is you start in with an opt-in program where you allow people to opt in. And by sharing their data, by sharing their information, they have an opportunity potentially to get lower premiums, lower cost. I think that could be a place to start. But you can never lose sight of, you and I can have the best ideas in the world, but we cannot pontificate to folks, because at the end of the day, there are a lot of folks, or a subset, that don't want to share their medical data, and under HIPAA, they have certain rights. So I would, start there, and but I think most folks now are they're willing to share if there was some sort of financial opportunity for them. The other thing in, this big ideas, right? So the other thing that we have in the US is everything in the US is based on a chronic disease payment system. So we take a population and we do a risk stratification of the population, how sick they are, and that's how much money that's given to the payer for this particular population. So I think that model's antiquated. I think there's an opportunity, because you only do that, maybe once a year. Well, people's conditions can change dramatically over a period of time. So, now with the sharing of medical information, medical data, I think there's opportunities for more what I call dynamic underwriting. Um, where real time you could maybe adjust people's risk scores based on certain things. So I think there's an opportunity to change that whole paradigm. And I think if people saw that, they could have, I don't want to say instant gratification, but for losing 20 pounds, for getting their blood pressure under control, for getting their blood glucose under control, there was some very near-term rewards, I think you could do a lot more. And so I think looking at the whole underwriting, the risk stratification, and taking this data and making it much more dynamic and adjusting it. So I'll give you an example. It's kind of like a financial FICO score, right? You have your FICO score. So why can't we have a healthcare FICO score? Now, hopefully, if I gain 10 pounds, my healthcare FICO score doesn't change too dramatically. But the point is, I think there are going to be many opportunities like that. And so, it's having, again, the data more real time. I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
So, Stephen, and I should mention to the audience, just as a reminder, that all of my interviews are unscripted. So I'm just going to do a time check. Do you have a hard stop in 10 minutes, or can you go a little bit beyond?
Uh, if you still want me, I always warn people, don't give a Middle Eastern guy the mic. It could be very dangerous. I always have time for you, Stephen. I hope the audience is finding this, useful in some way.
I mean, it's very useful. But I mean, you are so perfectly situated, though, in terms of moving the needle on population health. I want to dive a little bit deeper. Are you looking at things like body volume index and as a replacement for BMI, things like that, in conjunction with maybe a higher, um, or do you think that there's advantages in doing that and maybe more active use of glucose monitoring? Because really, there's such a, a direct, I would say, causality sort of correlation with your health. If you even did some active glucose monitoring, and you can get them now, right, at the consumer level, things like that. So, what are your thoughts about some of these areas in the marketplace, and where do you think it's going? Um, because you're at the hub of all of these different innovations that are happening.
It, it's Look, I think there's a lot of utility to what you just said. The challenge is that it's very hard in a silo, to change the system, because, you know, so everything we do is predicated upon, Medicare, guidelines and, the federal government. And I don't want to be critical, because they did miraculous things during the pandemic, getting the vaccine, approved, and through the system in a fraction of the time that it normally does. But um, un until there's more streamlined process with the government, recognition of some of these, I'll call them opportunities. Um, it's just difficult because in the U.S. You have it's tough to make incremental changes in U.S. healthcare. So I was with someone from the Gates Foundation, Maurizio Vecchioni, who we both know, and we were talking about innovation, and he brought up the concept of reverse innovation, and he was talking about he said, oh, where do you think the best phone system in the world is? And I'm like, I don't know, US. And then he's like, no, Kenya. I'm like, Kenya? Like, well, when they finally were able to deploy, their telecommunications, they were able to get the latest and greatest. And in fact, now people can do, the vast majority of all their banking off their phone. They don't need to step into a bank, and they have other features to it. So that, the challenges in the US is to take something like that, which is there's a lot of medical utility to what you just said, but you got to change an entire system. You have the government, then you have the federal government, you have the state government, you have the payers, you have the providers. I mean, there's so many different layers, and there's 1,000 points of veto along the way, so it makes it challenging. Now, let me step back for a second. I think for those folks on this um, that are investors, I think there's tremendous opportunities for investing in healthcare globally, because just like the example with Kenya, if you can implement something and you're not having to kind of replace something existing, I think those could be, tremendous opportunities globally, especially given, the advancement of global Wi-Fi. So I think those are tremendous opportunities there. But I personally, I think there's probably 20 different examples of using different metrics, like you mentioned, and there's a lot of utility. But again, you've got regulatory, you've got reimbursements, you've got educating the providers, you got educating the patients. it's there's opportunity, there's challenges, but there are opportunities there. It's just the question is, you know, where do you want to hang your hat on? And and I think there's there's a lot of opportunities for sure. It just at some point you're like drinking out of a fire hose and picking out the one or two that are the best ones. It takes a lot of discernment.
When you scan the world globally in terms of medical healthcare and population health, who do you think are kind of the stars out there that you think, wow, that they got a pretty good system outside the US?
Oh, outside the US. Well, that's a good question. So, you look at a place like Germany. So in Germany, if you take, they did a study, the Commonwealth Fund did a study, and they took the top 11 industrialized countries in the world, and Germany had the best outcomes, and it was near the bottom of their GDP. I think at that point, and this was a couple years ago, it was 11% of their GDP. And so they spent less and they got way more bang for the buck than we did. So I think there's some lessons there. I think somehow, some way, globally, healthcare has become a political hot potato. It's become a political football. Some people think government's the answer. Some people, private sector is the answer. But where I see it being most effectively provided is in these public-private partnerships, a place like Germany where everyone has some basic coverage and you can buy more. So it's a combination type system. So I think, we have to, look at best practices. Now, obviously, people have cancer. If they have, you know, you know, more complicated conditions, the US is great, but unfortunately, again, our incentives are aligned with treating folks instead of keeping them healthy. And fundamentally, that's going to have to change. And I think places like Germany are good examples of what can be done, in these public-private partnerships. But I just want to make this clear, and this is not political. It is our absolute strong view that healthcare is a right. It's not a privilege. Everyone should have access to basic healthcare, and affordable and accessible healthcare globally. It's an absolute, that's in our DNA. That's who we are. We passionately believe that. And if you give people health, you give them hope. And if you give them hope, you'll give them everything. And I will tell you, there's so many stories, which I won't get into today, where we provided low cost, affordable healthcare to people globally that never had access to it. And let me tell you, Stephen, that has done more to build bridges across the religious, political, and socioeconomic divide than you could possibly imagine. We need to put the care back in healthcare. And yes, it's a business, but you can never lose that, the human in humanity. You can never lose that. And unfortunately, in this day and age where, with technology, everything's going so quickly, I feel that sometimes that gets lost. And so it's something, I try to remind folks every day, and I hope your audience will keep that to heart.
I was just thinking that UAE seems to be doing, making a lot of investments and sort of merging technology and also going global and taking that back into the Middle East. So I sort of really interesting what they're doing and including their sovereign fund. I'm thinking Michigan is probably what, top 3 in the US in terms of interoperability and so on. So you got some leadership there and you're part of that, right? So
Thank you. Thank you. Well, Michigan is very, very, very ahead of the curve on a bunch of things, for sure. I think, So there's an interesting dynamic in the Middle East. Yes, they are building a lot more healthcare infrastructure. Yes, they're trying to do medical manufacturing. But here's the reality. The reality is, in many cases, the government pays for people to get healthcare elsewhere. So it's like a little bit of a vacation as well. And uh, so again, this is a real life thing. So, oftentimes people want to come to places like the U.S. or Europe for healthcare because they can, you know, not only get good quality care, but also it's a way to get the family out. But look, I think more and more, if you're going to look at any country and places like Saudi Arabia, they are making huge strides to becoming, a world-class place. But until you can get the healthcare to a certain level, you know, it's, it's you're not going to achieve, because if you don't have access to that healthcare, you can have the nicest houses and the nicest buildings and all these business opportunities, but people are going to be reluctant to relocate their families to places that don't have world-class healthcare. And so I think that's a big part of the calculus for many folks. And I think there's tremendous opportunities there. And again, healthcare is growing globally. It's a big business, and so there are a lot of challenges in a lot of places, but those create a lot of opportunities as well.
So I want to spend a little bit of time in terms of your contributions in terms of social impact. I mean, you were in 2017 named the American Diabetes Father of the Year, and you're part of an esteemed lineup of global leaders at the Cure Foundation's fifth International Vatican Conference in 2021, presented with the Vatican Pontifical Hero Award. I mean, there's so much of this. Chairman of the American Diabetes Association, Michigan, the Citizens RX, Endeavor Detroit, Henry Ford Hospital, Valatura, the Council of Harvard's Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. I mean, the list goes on and on, all of these honors, even currently, right? So can you talk about that and those initiatives, and why are you doing that, and what you hope to do through all of this? And you've got presidential awards right back in 2022, 2023, in terms of all the work you're doing. Just a remarkable amount of giving. So I like to mind that a little bit and just get your reaction to that work and what you hope to accomplish.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. Well, all those recognitions are nice, and I'm grateful that people would recognize my family and I. Um, but at the end of the day, I think our meaning, our purpose is, to do everything in our power, not only to make healthcare as affordable, accessible to as many people as we can, but I really believe a lot of people are looking to be part of something bigger than themselves. And I have met the richest, most famous people in the world, and they're looking for something. You think they have it all, right? I don't care who you are. And so having the opportunity and privilege to be part of some of these things, I mean, yes, the individual recognitions, they're nice, but I don't wake up in the morning and think about what kind of recognition I'm going to get, this week or this month or this year. I mean, that's not who we are. But those recognitions do enable us to kind of share a message. And the message is, that the only way we can change the world, Margaret Mead said, getting a bunch of thoughtful, committed people getting together is the only thing to ever really change the world. And those afford us opportunities to have discussions with like-minded folks and and really talk about ways we can elevate humanity. Look, I'm 53. I want to be on this earth as long as I can, but it's really all about my children. Adele is 11, Grayson's 9, Gavin's 7, and you know when I leave this earth one day, I want the world to be a better place for them. And, you know, the best way that we can do it is through healthcare and, we get to meet a lot of amazing people like yourself. And so the extent that we could, 1 + 1 can equal 11 synchronicity, you know, um, in Proverbs in the Bible, it says iron sharpens iron. And to the extent that we can be a catalytic force, for change. But I just want to make it clear, it's not about us at all. And if I never got another recognition in my journey, I'm good. I've had such a blessed life. It's all about, elevating humanity and making the world a better place, being part of something bigger than yourself. And so, I don't look at the awards as I don't look at the awards as or recognitions as something about me, but I look at it just more, it's just another opportunity to share a message that, we're all in this together. If I'm good and you're not good and he's not good and she's not good, I'm not good. We're all in this together. We cannot think of our world in a very kind of monolithic way. We're all connected. Um, that's the way I look at it. And I and it's nice to get, all these recognitions, but at the end of the day, that's not who we are. And who we are, hopefully, just like when my father died 3 years ago, he left an indelible imprint on so many people, so many, you don't even realize it. And so if someone down the road or people down the road say, you know what, you know who they are, their personal richness, in meaning and purpose, and is, they're richer people than they are, anything in the bank account. To me, that will mean that we've done, hopefully, a lot of good for the world.
I mean, I can see this though. I mean, you get the awards and the recognition, but you're leveraging that to even do more purposeful leadership, innovation, capital, business, and sustainability and impact. A good example is chairperson of the JDRF road trip in 2021. You were raising money for accelerating research towards a cure for type 1 diabetes, right? I mean, or you spoke at the World Expo in Dubai in January 2022 about how to reimagine the global medical supply chain, which has to be addressed. So you're always leveraging it to say, hey, let's do something to improve or to help or to move the needle. I mean, that's just an amazing contribution you're making. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, a lot of people ask, what is your business thesis? What is your plan? Like, honestly, we're not that smart. I tell people we have more scars than stars, but really, we're opportunistic. We try to solve problems. That's been our journey. Whether it's diabetes, whether it's the global supply chain, which is what we talked about at the expo. Find areas that we can hopefully shed light on, start dialogue, build partnerships, build collaborations, and hopefully ultimately improve things. So we do our best, but nobody can do it on their own. And I do think it's really important to have these kind of opportunities. And again, Stephen, I'm grateful for you considering me. I know all the amazing people you've had on this, but I'm grateful for this opportunity because hopefully, we can, inspire the hearts and minds of folks and maybe, have them think about some things, maybe start some other conversations that hopefully can lead to some positive outcomes.
So I'm going to end with one final question, and I know you love this. Your grandmother's favorite phrase from Mother Teresa: "Not all of us can do great things, but we could do small things with great love." So, using that as a bit of a catalyst, what's your recommendation to the audience? And that's the final question for our chat today.
every day there's an opportunity to make a difference in great ways and in small ways. Yes, Stephen, you have people like you that are writing books and speaking about the bleeding edge, opportunities in technology, and not all of us have those capabilities, but everyone can be kind to someone. Everybody can maybe take that extra step or go that extra mile when people are in need. Um, there's a lot of people that they lead lives of quiet desperation, especially today, especially with social media, because communication has changed. Don't miss an opportunity to do something. It may be just spending an extra minute with someone, trying to help out. It may be just listening to someone. It may be, I mean, it's there's just so many ways that can show people that you care. And that's something, and it doesn't have to be money, doesn't have to be writing books, it doesn't have to be winning the Nobel Prize, it doesn't have to be building unicorn companies. I think there's a richness, there's a currency in just authentically and selflessly sharing who you are. And, you can't look at it. We talked about scarcity and abundance, so it's not a one for one thing. It's think of caring as you're putting a unit in your spiritual bank account. So when you do something for someone, you take this unit, you put it in your bank account. It may not come back, and but if keep adding units to that spiritual bank account, I believe it comes back to you in spades in many different ways, in great ways and in small ways. So and every single time that I've given of myself, especially in small ways that you don't get recognitions, ways that you're not in for any kudos, it just leads to a much more meaningful life. And people that have purpose in their life, they're happier, they're more resilient, they're more successful. And so I just and I think that Mother Teresa knew what her journey was about, and I encourage everyone to not miss any opportunities to show you care to people in the world.
Well, I mean, Stephen, you definitely are the North Star for all of the things that you talk about: resilience and agility and giving and servant leadership and purposeful leadership, compassion, impact, innovation, sustainable business. You do it all. Just remarkable. So thank you for coming in and sharing all of your insights with our audience.
Hey, thank you for having me, and can't wait to see you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. The population health, right?
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.